years, countless victims have waited for justice. Over these years, hundreds of individuals have sought justice for these victims and their families. Many have dedicated their virtual entire professions to seeking this answer. For many of us, it was more than a professional commitment. It became personal for many of us. For me, here in Sacramento County, in June of 1976, I was 12. I grew up in the east area of Sacramento, near the cluster of where these crimes began. My sisters ranged from 10 to 16 at the time. As I have said many times over the last 18 years, at least for me, for us here in Sacramento, it was a time of innocence in 1976. No one locked their doors. Kids rode their bikes to school. Parents let their children play outside. The only thing we were told as a family was you just needed to be home before dark. We did not have things like cell phones or social media. And then for all of us here in this community that lived in this community during this time, it all changed.
Good afternoon and welcome to True Crime Mysteries. Today we'll be wrapping up the GSK series by asking ourselves, who is he? What kind of person could create so much chaos? If you haven't watched the first 3 videos in this series yet, please do so. The links are in the description. Let's get into it. His crimes were pervasive and he impacted so many lives. He once was a boogeyman plaguing communities for years, only to disappear. Even in making these videos, multiple people have commented detailing how their lives had been forever changed by these crimes. 20 years after the crimes had been committed, most of the evidence had been destroyed. This was routine evidence room procedure. Cases that had passed the statute of limitations were destroyed, needing to make space for newer evidence. Some labs, however, kept all of their evidence on the Erons, hopeful that one day it would be needed in a trial. Paul Holes, a criminal analyst turned investigator, took on the case in the late 1990s after coming across the evidence boxes marked EAR in red lettering. He connected with a criminalist in Irvine County named Mary Hong. In 2001, crime labs in Contra County and Irvine compared DNA samples and were finally able to connect the crimes to the same offender. The EAR had benefited greatly from different police departments being historically terrible at sharing information and working together. His criminal career spanned from 1972 to 1986, 14 years of terror in multiple communities. He had acquired multiple names with each evolution, always just barely out of the grasp of police. He was intelligent. Single-story homes. Single-story houses had more predictable escape routes. He could also get a 360 vantage of the home, and he could spend hours knowing no one could see him by being able to see overhead. His movements were subtle and largely unnoticeable. An open gate here, things in the backyard moved slightly, a ladder quietly moved from against a fence in one yard to against the garage of another home. He would creep along people's roofs, which most people wrote off as an animal because the idea that a man was on the roof of their home using it as a way of getting a look into their neighbor's window was too absurd to put into words. People would clean their gutters in the years following the attacks, only to find jewelry that had been stolen from a neighbor. But the decades passed and his crimes became a thing of the past, like a reoccurring nightmare that you thought back on. And with those passing decades, new technologies arose. The Green River Killer was caught with DNA evidence, and he had known the technology would eventually catch up on him. Dennis Rader, the BTK, when he was arrested, he detailed in his confession that as he got older, It was physically more challenging to commit his crimes, and after his last murder, he stopped because he had had a close call with a victim, almost getting an upper hand. It is believed that these could be reasons as to why the JSK stopped attacking couples, because Greg Sanchez scared him. Even his last known victim was a single teenager that was home alone. After 1986, he disappears, but in 2018, he is identified.
We found the needle in the haystack, and it was right here in Sacramento. And with that, I would like to introduce our sheriff, Scott Jones.
Good afternoon. Before I talk a little bit about this case, I'd like to make just a couple preliminary comments. When I became sheriff in Sacramento in 2010, there were very few outstanding cases that drew the passion and the interest and the dogged determination to solve as the East Area Rapist. The sheriff that I took over from, Sheriff John McGinnis, who's here with us today, told me about the importance of it. And I don't know that I fully appreciated it at that time, but I can tell you that without exception, weekly, and sometimes more, I get telephone calls or emails to this day from former employees, former detectives, community members from all over this country that believe that they know or at least have some information on who the East Area Rapist was. I committed then to do everything that I could to solve it, and had a lot of conversations early on with District Attorney Schubert about how we could do it. And those discussions really touched the passion of both of us to solve this case. Both of us committed the best and the brightest, our hand-picked folks, to oversee the resolution of this case, and gave virtually unlimited resources and freedom to pursue whatever leads and technology currently existed. So I can tell you that over the last few days, as information started to point towards this individual, we started some surveillance, we were able to get some discarded DNA, and we were able to confirm what we thought we already knew, that we had our man. And yesterday afternoon, in a perfectly executed arrest, my detectives arrested James Joseph D'Angelo, 72 years old, living in Citrus Heights. I can tell you that although it was DNA ultimately that led us down the right road, there were a lot of places that road could have led. I don't want to underscore, I can't underscore enough, the absolute human factor, the dogged determination of not only the detectives working on this case, but the passion of the district attorney, myself, the community, and the victims. All too often we forget about talking about the victims. And today we at least brought the first step towards closure for those victims of these horrendous crimes. So I want to thank not only the district attorney and the crime lab and the DNA that helped us get here, but my own detectives and the detectives from all of these folks represented by the leaders standing behind me when we put together this working group 2 years ago and brought in the FBI, who was more than happy to be part of this team and effort. We had no way of knowing that we'd be standing here talking about the resolution of all of these crimes. So I have to thank them, and again underscore the importance of the human factor and the dogged determination and passion of the individuals and human beings that led us down the right road to this individual today.
In 2016, the FBI offered a $50,000 reward for any new information that led to an arrest. The initiative sparked a new interest in the case. Paul Holes and his team of investigators took the ear's DNA profile taken from a victim's assault kit and uploaded it into a personal genomics website called GEDmatch. This was used to reverse engineer a family tree. GEDmatch relies on DNA kits like Ancestry.com and 23andMe, where people voluntarily submit their DNA in order to create family trees or find more information about their ancestral lineage. GEDmatch was able to identify over 10 distant relatives. From there, they worked with genealogists to create a large family tree, and from that tree, they had 2 suspects. When they ruled out one, they were left with a Joseph James DeAngelo Jr. Joseph James DeAngelo wasn't what they initially thought to be the perfect fit. He was much older than the suspect they were looking for. He had been born in 1945, putting him at 31 years old when he was attacking in the Sacramento area. Based on the witness accounts, they had always been looking for someone in their late teens. Regardless, DeAngelo was staked out for weeks, and during this time he was witnessed driving his motorcycle, he exercised daily in his home, he moved in such a way that the cops watching him didn't believe he was a man in his 70s. He moved around more like he was in his 50s. So who is Joseph James DeAngelo Jr., and how did he evade capture for over 4 decades? Let's break down his life. On November 8, 1945, Joseph James DeAngelo Jr. was the second child to Kathleen and Joseph DeAngelo. Kathleen was a housewife, typical for the time, and Joseph Sr. was in the Air Forces. Joseph Sr. fought in World War II and had been wounded when serving as a gunner. The couple had 4 children, 2 girls and 2 boys. The family was stationed in military housing in New York area for the first 5 years of JJ Jr.'s life. When the Korean War begins, the family is relocated to New Jersey and then later to Washington. Joseph Sr. is well known as being a violent man. The abuse he inflicted on his wife was so well known that his superiors had threatened multiple times to stop hitting his wife or he would be thrown out of the military. Kathleen was also not a soft mother. When she was abused by her husband, she would pass on the abuse to her children. A grandchild of the youngest daughter said that the kids would double up on layers of clothing to lessen the blows. It was an altogether miserable household filled with loud chaos and violence. In 1952, Joseph Sr. was transferred to a base in Germany. Then 2 years later, they were transferred back to New Jersey in 1954. The same grandchild said that JJ Jr., who was 9, and his youngest sister, Constance, who was 7 at the time, were playing in an abandoned warehouse. They were approached by 2 men who violently attacked his sister, and when they told their parents about the incident, they were told to never speak of it. The family moved around almost yearly, transferring to different bases. In 1956, his father was transferred to California, and in 1959, records show he was transferred to Mathers Air Force Base, and the family purchased a small home in Rancho Cordova. JJ Jr. is 14 when he starts middle school in Northern California. JJ Jr. then starts Folsom High School in 1961, which is why detectives had a hard time finding a suspect via local yearbooks. They were looking in the wrong decade. In 1963, his father was transferred to Orlando, and there he filed for divorce from Kathleen. Kathleen and the kids stayed in California, and his mother took up with another military man named Jack Basenko. In September 1964, JJ Jr. gets his GED and enlists in the Navy on a 4-year enlistment. While he is overseas, his mother and Jack get married, and she begins waitressing at the Auburn Denny's. Joseph Jr. served in 3 deployments, from 1965 to 1967, during the Vietnam War. His time during deployment is often a little murky. He has large stretches of time unaccounted for, and he even is reported as AWOL for 3 days while he was back in the U.S. He was deployed in 1968 on a non-combat deployment, and when the Vietnam War was at its peak, he was exempt from the draft and was allowed to attend college back in California, and began attending the Sierra College in Rockland when he was 22 years old. In 1969, his father had remarried, completely abandoning his first family, and were posted in Korea. Joseph Jr. met Bonnie Caldwell in college. She was 18 and he was 23. Bonnie described him as an energetic and worldly Vietnam vet. Soon after meeting, the two were engaged, but Bonnie began seeing red flags early on in the relationship. He was often very rough with her, especially in the bedroom, and she had finally had enough. In 1971, she broke things off, and he began aggressively stalking her. She said that he had even attempted to force her by gunpoint to marry him. Fortunately, her father chased him away. However, she dropped out of school for a semester and changed her major to put as much space as she could between her and D'Angelo. Bonnie married an accountant in 1972, and Joseph purchased his first home less than 2 miles from Bonnie and her new husband, and in 1972 was when Rancho Cordova began receiving calls of a cat burglar in the neighborhood. In 1973, D'Angelo graduated with honors with a degree in criminal justice from the California State University in Sacramento. He then starts an internship with the Roseville Police Department, which was near Citrus Heights. He was there for around 8 months before signing on with the Exeter Police Department as an officer. He was 27. A coworker described him as too smart and overqualified to be at the small family police department. Really, everyone was confused as to why he wanted to be there. It was kind of believed he was using it as a stepping stone to get into the FBI, which seemed like a much more suitable place for him to be. In this year, there was an escalation in the cat burglaries, and a dog had been killed. The burglaries were spreading from Rancho Cordova to the Citrus Heights area as well as Carmichael. In 1973, D'Angelo also marries a woman named Shannon Hubbard in the fall. D'Angelo started taking night classes at the police academy at the College of the Sequoias. This was where Claude Snelling had also been a professor. D'Angelo had actually been promoted to sergeant. According to a coworker, D'Angelo and his wife were living in Visalia, and he would commute to Exeter. During his first year of marriage was when the Visalia ransacker was at his peak. He wouldn't have been investigating his own break-ins, but when Claude Snelling had been murdered, multiple police departments were called in to help with the manhunt, and this included the Exeter department. After the McGowan shooting, D'Angelo transferred to the Auburn Police Department, which was a 45-minute drive from Rancho Cordova. After he transferred to Auburn, the Visalia ransackings abruptly stop. He officially starts with the Auburn Police Department in June or July of 1976, and the first attack from the ear was June 18, 1976. Here's a photo of D'Angelo investigating an obscene caller. There is a very high likelihood that he investigated his own crimes while at the Auburn Police Department. He was with the Auburn Police Department during the entirety of the ear attacks, but was fired in 1979 for stealing dog repellent and a hammer from a hardware store in Citrus Heights. He had been caught on July 2nd and suspended until his termination. He did appeal but later withdrew. His boss reported that after he had fired D'Angelo, his daughter saw a man looking in through her window, and when he went outside, the man was gone, but there were fresh shoe impressions around his entire house. When he heard D'Angelo was arrested in connection to the ear attacks, he is certain D'Angelo had been at his house that night. July 5th was the last attack in the ear attacks. D'Angelo was officially unemployed in 1980, but was believed to have been doing odd jobs working under the table. His wife was finishing her law degree around this time. During the original Night Stalker attacks, he is in his mid-30s, and it is unclear what his connection to Galito was, but I'm sure it's a detail that will come out in his trial. D'Angelo's wife is pregnant for the first time in 1981, and she gave birth to their first daughter. Her second pregnancy was in 1986. Just after becoming pregnant, there was the slaying of Janelle Cruz. He had a third daughter in 1989, and it was at this point that his marriage was not working for his wife. He owned a home in Canyon Oak Drive in Citrus Heights, and he must have been doing something for work because he was officially unemployed until 1990 when he began working as a mechanic at the Save Mart Distribution Center in Roseville, where he worked until he retired. He and his wife are in family courts in 1991 for what was believed to be their separation. They never formally divorced until D'Angelo was arrested in 2018, but Sharon lived with their daughters in Roseville, where she practiced law as a divorce lawyer. In 1994, D'Angelo's younger brother was arrested for a burglary in LA. There is a theory that D'Angelo enlisted his brother to assist him in the attacks, but at this point in time, there is little evidence to support that theory. However, that could change in the future. After his separation, he lived a relatively quiet life in Citrus Heights. His neighbors reported him as being an often irritable grouch. However, one neighbor received multiple phone calls from D'Angelo threatening to deliver a load of death because of their barking dog. He wasn't an animal person. He retired from his mechanic job in 2017, and his daughter and granddaughter were living with him in his Citrus Heights home when he was arrested in 2018. At his arrest, he didn't seem surprised. However, he did ask the arresting officers to turn the oven off because he had a roast in there. He wasn't a well-liked man. He didn't have many people singing his praises. He is often described as a serious, stickler for rules type person that never fit in any of his workplaces. He wasn't close to his family either, with many of his siblings estranged. More personal details have yet to be made clear, but will more than likely come out during his trial. I would be most interested to hear from his soon-to-be ex-wife as to what he did for work during the 1980s. He has been in police custody since 2018, and most notable was his change in physical capabilities from the time of his arrest to when he was wheeled into the courtroom in a wheelchair with his lawyer to hear his charges. He seemed to be having some trouble standing unassisted, which seemed odd to police as only a few weeks earlier he was seen zipping around on his motorcycle no problem. His lawyer also seemed to be speaking to him very loudly as if he couldn't hear perfectly fine during his arrest. The drastic change from how he was then to how he was when he was being surveilled were night and day. He seemed to have aged himself 20 years once he was arrested. He was no longer the man who exercised daily, but one that needed to be pushed in a wheelchair. This ruse is most likely thought up either by himself or his lawyer in order to try and get sympathy from the jurors when it gets to that point. His pre-trial has been set for May 12th, 2020. Well, that is it for this series, for now anyways. I'll do an update during or after his trial. We'll see what comes out of that. I am super proud of this series. It was a lot of research, and I feel like this is one serial killer that has never been super well covered either here on YouTube or even traditional media. I think it's probably because it was just so big with so much information to piece together, but I think it was super important to cover because I referenced it so many times in my other cold case videos and because it was a case worth bringing more awareness to for the victims. There will be justice for them, and there is a face to put on the monster. As I mentioned before, I will be taking a break from the serial offenders for a moment, but I have a lot of other video ideas to get out. Please hit the subscribe button if you enjoyed the series. It lets me know that you want me to make more like it, and subscribe if you haven't already because I make more content like this. If you want to support the channel and me, there are 2 donation options in the description box. I appreciate your support greatly. It helps me to make more content. Thank you for your support, kind words, and so far 2020 has been off to a great start. And I can't wait to see where it takes the channel. You guys are so great. I will see you very soon. Bye.